It was a Tuesday morning in October when Officer Glen Turley made the last uncomplicated decision of his career. He saw a woman cross Auburn Avenue against the light. He pulled over. He ordered her to the sidewalk. She complied immediately, hands visible. ID already out. He ran her name. It came back clean. He put the handcuffs on anyway. What Turley didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, standing on that corner with the particular certainty of a man who has never had to wonder whether the law was on his side, was that the woman in front of him was a special prosecutor in the Georgia Attorney General's office. That she had spent the last 14 months building the legislation that would give the state the power to dissolve police departments exactly like his, that his body camera was running, and that she knew it. Dessa Drummond had been studying body camera policy for 14 months. She had written the chain of custody requirement that meant he could not delete this footage without triggering an automatic audit. She stood on that sidewalk and said nothing. Gave him nothing. Let the camera see everything. She wasn't being processed. She was collecting evidence. If you've ever had to be twice as careful, twice as composed, twice as documented just to be treated like you belong, this channel is for you. Like this video. Subscribe. And stay, because Dessa's story is just the beginning. To understand what happened on Auburn Avenue, you have to understand what Dessa Drummond was carrying when she crossed that street. 14 months earlier, she had started building something that had never existed in the state of Georgia. Not because no one had thought of it, because the people who thought of it had also thought about what it would cost them, and decided the cost was too high. Dessa had decided something different, the Georgia Pattern and Practice Accountability Act. 14 pages. Every word deliberate, every clause load-bearing, every section written by a woman who understood that the law she was creating would be challenged by people with both the money and the motivation to destroy it. So she built it the way you build something designed to last, slowly, carefully, and with no room for the kind of ambiguity that gets exploited in court by attorneys who are paid to find it. What the bill would do was simple to explain and almost impossible to pass. It would give the Georgia Attorney General's office the authority to investigate police departments, not individual officers, departments, when documented patterns of misconduct emerged. Patterns, systems, the architecture of harm rather than isolated incidents. Federal law had carried a version of this authority since 1994. Georgia, 30 years later, still had nothing equivalent at the state level. Not an oversight. A choice. Because here is what the absence of that law meant in practice. Every time a Georgia prosecutor found evidence of systematic misconduct, a department running illegal quotas, a precinct with a documented pattern of excessive force, a police culture that protected bad actors through institutional silence, the options were exactly two. Prosecute individual officers who were shielded by qualified immunity and union contracts and the near-impossible evidentiary standard of proving individual intent inside a systemic failure. Or do nothing. Those were the choices. One that rarely worked. One that changed nothing. Dessa had been living inside that choice for the entirety of her career, and she had decided, 14 months ago, that she was done choosing between them. She was building the third option. The bill sat in Senator Paulette Greer's committee, 6 votes short of the floor. 6 senators. All 6 representing districts with active police union chapters. All 6 having received the kind of quiet institutional pressure that doesn't come in writing and doesn't need to. The phone calls, the endorsements, the campaign donation patterns that communicate everything without saying anything that can be quoted. None of the 6 were corrupt in the obvious sense. They were calculating. They had constituencies that included both the communities harmed by the quota system and the officers running it, and they had not yet been given a reason to weigh one against the other in public. Dessa had been trying to give them a reason for 14 months. The data was building. Reginald Osai had been working the citation records for 9 months, and what he was finding was precise and damning, the kind of numbers that didn't leave room for alternative interpretation. But data, by itself, moves minds in conference rooms. It doesn't always move votes on a Senate floor. Dessa knew this. She had been in enough rooms to know the difference between a senator who understands an argument and a senator who has been given permission to act on it. The 6 she needed weren't waiting for more data. They were waiting for a moment. Something that made the cost of inaction higher than the cost of action. Something that made the pattern visible not as a spreadsheet, but as a story. Specific, undeniable, impossible to absorb into the background noise of a city that generated incidents daily and processed most of them into silence. She didn't know yet what that moment would look like. She was still looking for it on the morning she left her office 6 minutes late, her laptop bag on her shoulder. The revised bill language saved in 3 separate locations, because she was the kind of person who saved things in 3 separate locations, walking fast toward a meeting that was going to give her the final language she needed. She stepped off the curb on Auburn Avenue 3 seconds before the walk signal changed, and Officer Glen Turley's cruiser was 200 feet away. She didn't know it yet, but the moment had just found her. Before Glen Turley ever saw Dessa Drummond step off that curb, she already knew what he was doing. Not him specifically, the system he was operating inside. She had been studying it for 9 months through the work of a forensic data analyst named Reginald Ossie, a man whose particular gift was finding the pattern that individual incidents were specifically designed to obscure. Reginald didn't work with hunches. He worked with numbers, and he worked with the patience of someone who understood that the truth inside a data set doesn't announce itself. It hides in the relationship between columns. It lives in the gap between what the numbers say individually and what they say when you put them next to each other and refuse to look away. He had started with 3 years of misdemeanor citation data from the department. Public records, on all of it, the kind of information any citizen could request, that almost no one did, because pulling it and parsing it required time and methodology that most people didn't have. Reginald had both. He sorted the data by citation type, by location, by the racial demographics of the cited individuals, cross-referenced against the census data for each block where citations were issued. What he found was not subtle. 73% of jaywalking citations issued by the department over 3 years had been given to black pedestrians, in a neighborhood that was 41% black, not 60%, not 55%, which might have been explained by foot traffic patterns or enforcement concentration. 73, a number that precise doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't emerge from unconscious bias alone. So it requires direction, not necessarily written direction, not a memo with a number at the top and a signature at the bottom, but expectation. Consistent, sustained, department-wide expectation that has been communicated clearly enough to produce a result that consistent over 3 years and across dozens of officers. Expectation enforced through something. Reginald found the something when he pulled the overtime records. He cross-referenced citation volume per officer per month against overtime hours logged in the same period. The correlation was not ambiguous. Officers who hit 14 or more misdemeanor arrests in a given month logged an average of 11 hours of overtime. Officers who fell below 10 misdemeanor arrests averaged 2 hours, not 3, not 5. 2. The gap between 11 hours and 2 hours at a city salary are down. He never needed to. The quota wasn't down. He never needed to. The quota wasn't in any policy manual, any training document, any official directive that could be subpoenaed and entered into evidence. It was in the paycheck, delivered every 2 weeks with the precision of a system that had been running long enough to become invisible to the people inside it. 11 years of that math teaches an officer everything the official documentation leaves out. 11 years of watching the officers who hit their numbers go home with extra hours, while the ones who didn't sat with their regular pay. That is an education that doesn't require a classroom. Dosser never said the number aloud, and the overtime said it for him. And the result, rendered in Reginald's spreadsheet across 3 years and thousands of data points, was a department that had become structurally dependent on misdemeanor enforcement in black neighborhoods. Not because every officer in it was consciously racist, because the incentive system rewarded enforcement where it was easiest to execute, and the neighborhood where it was easiest to execute was the one where residents had the least institutional recourse, the least likelihood of filing a formal complaint that would go anywhere, the least ability to make the cost of targeting them higher than the reward. Dessa had read Reginald's findings on a Tuesday morning 9 months ago and sat with them for a long time before she said anything. Because what the numbers described wasn't just misconduct. It was architecture, a financial structure built on the systematic over-policing of one community, running for 11 years, generating $4.2 million in annual overtime, and operating in plain sight inside public records that anyone could have requested. No one had put them together until Reginald did, and the man whose department those numbers described had no idea that the woman he was about to handcuff on Auburn Avenue had been reading them for 9 months. Here is what Glen Turley knew when he put the handcuffs on Dessa Drummond. He knew she had crossed against the light. He knew her name. He knew her record was clean. No priors, no outstanding warrants, nothing in the system that gave him cause for anything beyond a standard pedestrian citation. He knew his body camera was running because it was always running from the moment he started the ignition. And after 8 years on the force, the red light in his peripheral vision was no more remarkable to him than the radio static or the smell of the upholstery. It was background. It was routine. That was everything he knew. Here is what he didn't check. Whether departmental protocol required him to offer a citation in lieu of booking for a first offense pedestrian violation. It did. I asked him to identify the specific nature of the violation she was being cited for had any evidentiary basis. It didn't. Asking the nature of a charge is not resistance. It is a right. Turley had filed it as resistance anyway, the way an officer files a charge when he wants the paperwork to tell a cleaner story than the stop actually produced. 3 procedural violations. Cuffing after a clean return. A resisting charge with no basis. Failure to offer citation in lieu of booking, each one individually explainable as a judgment call, each one individually survivable in a disciplinary review. Together, as across 312 similar incidents in Reginald's dataset, they were something else entirely. They were the fingerprints of a department that had been running so long without oversight that its officers had stopped checking whether their judgment calls were defensible, because defensibility had never been required, because the machinery that was supposed to require it had never been built. Until now. Dessa cataloged all 3 violations in the back of Turley's patrol car while he sat in the front seat filling out the paperwork. She did not do it on paper. She had no paper. Her bag was in the front seat. She had nothing but her memory and 14 months of procedural literacy that made her memory sufficient. She ran the list the way she ran everything, completely, without rushing. I'm filing each item in the correct mental folder. Not for vindication. Not because she was planning how to fight the charges, though she would fight them, and they would not survive contact with a judge for more than 48 hours. She cataloged them because each one was a data point. And data points became patterns. And patterns were the entire foundation of what the Georgia Pattern and Practice Accountability Act was built to prosecute. She was sitting inside her own evidence. And then the other thing settled over her, quietly, without drama. The way important things tend to arrive when you've been building toward them long enough that recognition feels less like surprise and more like confirmation. The department had just handed her the one thing her bill had been missing. 14 months of data. Reginald's spreadsheet. For 73%. $4.2 million in overtime. A quota system documented in numbers precise enough to be irrefutable and abstract enough that the 6 undecided senators could still keep a comfortable distance from them. Data lives on a page. Data can be questioned, contextualized, reframed by an attorney with enough time and enough billable hours. Data is not the same as a face. But citation number 004-1-887 had a face. It was hers. A special prosecutor in the Georgia Attorney General's office, clean record, business attire, hands behind her back on a public street, cuffed after a clean return on a jaywalking stop, resisting charge filed for asking a procedural question, his body camera running. The footage stored in the department's own retention system under a chain of custody protocol that required preservation for 90 days minimum. She had written that provision herself. She sat in the back of Glen Turley's patrol car and did not let him see any of this. Did not let him see the recognition or the precision or the particular cold clarity of a prosecutor who has just watched 14 months of circumstantial architecture become direct evidence. She gave him nothing. She looked straight ahead and let the camera see everything and processed the rest the way she had processed everything in her career, completely, silently, and without wasting a single thing. Turley filed the paperwork. He did not know what he had signed. He would. The name came back from booking at 10:47 a.m. The duty officer read it again, and flagged it to the watch commander within 4 minutes. The watch commander read it and called Chief Raymond Dessa directly, skipping the intermediate step because there are names that tell you immediately this is not a call you hold until the afternoon briefing. Dessa Drummond, Special Prosecutor, Georgia Attorney General's Office, arrested on Auburn Avenue at 9:14 a.m. on a pedestrian interference charge and a resisting citation that wouldn't survive a first-year law student's scrutiny. Dessa called his deputy chief. His deputy chief called the city attorney. The city attorney did not deliberate. He had been in that office for 16 years, and he understood, with the efficiency of a man who has navigated institutional crises long enough to recognize their shape on contact, exactly what this was and exactly what it required. 3 words: drop the charges. Dessa issued the directive before noon. The charges were voided in the system. The booking report flagged for administrative review. The machinery that the city had built over decades to quietly absorb inconvenient incidents was activated without ceremony. The way you flip a switch, you've flipped so many times the motion is no longer conscious. This was how it worked. This was precisely how it had always worked. Not conspiracy in the dramatic sense. Not a room full of men deciding to protect each other in a single decisive meeting. Something more durable than that. An institutional reflex. A system that had learned, over 11 years, how to make problems disappear before they became stories, and had done it so reliably that the people operating inside it had stopped thinking of it as a choice. It was just procedure. The informal procedure that ran beneath the official one and did most of the actual work. This was why the quota system had survived for 11 years without consequence, not because no one had seen it. People had seen it. Officers had seen it. Residents had seen it. 3 of Sergeant Albright's internal complaints had described it in documented detail. Each one had been reviewed, dismissed, and absorbed. The system didn't survive because it was invisible. It survived because everyone who saw it clearly enough to threaten it was offered the option of not seeing it, and the cost of refusing that option had always been higher than the cost of accepting it. The charges disappear. The apology call gets made, carefully worded, institutional in its sympathy, and precise in its absence of admission. The incident gets processed into the background noise of a city that generates incidents daily. The person on the other end of the call takes the non-apology, because what else is there to take, and the machinery rolls forward. That was the playbook. Dessa had run it before. He ran it now. What he did not understand, what he had no framework to understand, because the playbook had never failed him, was that Dessa did not need the charges. She had never needed the charges. The charges were a misdemeanor filing on a pedestrian stop. Survivable, dismissible, the kind of thing that disappears into the administrative record and leaves almost no trace. She wasn't going to build a pattern and practice case on a jaywalking citation. That was not the asset Turley had handed her on Auburn Avenue. The asset was the footage. His body camera had been running from the moment he turned on the ignition. The footage was stored in the department's own retention system, logged automatically under the chain of custody protocol that governed all body camera recordings from the moment a misdemeanor was filed. 90 days minimum retention. Mandatory preservation. Deletion requiring a formal request that triggered an automatic audit. Dessa had written that provision herself. It was in the existing departmental policy, not her bill, not future law, current policy, already in effect, already governing the footage that was already sitting in the department's own servers at the moment Dessa made his call. Now he had dropped the charges. He could not drop the recording. The recording existed independent of the charges, governed by a protocol his own department had adopted, preserved in a system his own department operated, and accessible to an AG investigation under authorities that the Georgia Pattern and Practice Accountability Act, once it passed, would make impossible to obstruct. The charges were gone. The footage was permanent. Dessa had closed the door he could reach and left open the one that mattered. He didn't know that yet. He would spend the next several weeks believing he had managed the situation. He had not managed anything. He had simply confirmed, for a prosecutor, who was already building the case, that the institutional reflex was exactly as automatic and exactly as blind as the data had suggested it would be. The playbook had run itself, and Dessa had watched it happen from the other end of the phone. Corin Albright did not think of himself as a brave man. He had never wanted to be. He had wanted, at 22 years old when he joined the department, to be a good officer, which he understood then and still understood now as a specific and unglamorous thing. Show up. Do the work correctly. Treat people the way the badge was supposed to require you to treat them. Go home. He had not signed up for a crusade. He had signed up for a job he believed in. 14 years later, he was still showing up. The job he believed in had become something he didn't fully recognize. And the distance between what the work was supposed to be and what he watched it become every day had settled into him the way a long cold does. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a persistent weight that never quite lifted. He filed his first internal complaint 3 years ago. The quota system, documented in general terms, the pattern of overtime allocation, the correlation between misdemeanor volume and hours logged, the informal expectation that had never been written down but was understood by every officer on the floor as clearly as if it had been posted on the bulletin board. The complaint was reviewed by Internal Affairs. It was dismissed. The dismissal came with no explanation beyond the standard language about insufficient evidence of policy violation. He kept the complaint. He kept the dismissal. He filed them together in a folder he kept at home, not at the office. 18 months ago, he filed a second complaint, more specific this time. More data. He had spent his own hours, on his own time, on pulling the citation records and cross-referencing them by officer and by month, building the correlation table himself with no help and no methodology beyond the kind of careful attention that 14 years of police work teaches a person who has been paying attention to the right things. The second complaint was dismissed. He kept that one too. 6 months ago, he filed a third. This one was the most detailed he had produced. Specific officers, specific months, specific overtime figures beside specific citation volumes. The pattern rendered so precisely that dismissing it required active decision rather than passive inertia. Internal Affairs dismissed it anyway. The response this time included something the previous two had not. A note in his personnel file describing the complaints as a pattern of insubordination. It's not the misconduct he had documented, his documentation of it. He read the note, he made a copy, he put it in the folder with everything else. Corin Albright was not keeping the folder because he was planning something. He was keeping it because he was the kind of person who understood, at a level below articulation, that careful records outlast the institutions that would prefer they didn't exist. He didn't know who he was keeping them for. He knew someone would eventually need them. He trusted that the day would come when the right person would be in a position to use what he had, and when that day arrived, he intended to be ready. He was watching the news on the evening of Dessa's arrest when her name appeared on the screen. Special Prosecutor, Georgia AG's office. He arrested that morning on Auburn Avenue on a pedestrian charge that had already been quietly dropped. He watched the segment twice. Then he went to the AG's office website, found the public tip line, and called it. He left his name. He left his number. He did not describe the folder or its contents. He did not know if the call would be returned by someone who understood what he was offering. He trusted the name on the screen. Dessa called him back within the hour. He answered on the first ring. He said without preamble, because 14 months of waiting had made him allergic to anything that delayed the point. I have 14 months of quota records, citation data, overtime cross-references, 3 internal complaints and their dismissals, and a note in my file calling me insubordinate for filing them. I've been waiting for someone who knew what to do with them. There was a pause on the other end, not the pause of someone who needed time to understand what he was saying, the pause of someone who had just heard the final piece of something they had been building for a long time click into place. Then Dessa said, "I know exactly what to do with them." She was already reaching for a pen. Reginald Osai had spent 9 months building half a picture. What Albright's folder gave him was the other half, and when he put them together, the public records he had pulled himself alongside the internal records no one outside the department was supposed to have. What emerged was not a suggestion of misconduct. It was a blueprint of it, precise, complete, and documented in the department's own numbers. He started with what he already had. 3 years of misdemeanor citation data, the 73%, the overtime correlation, the financial architecture of a quota system that had never needed to announce itself because the paycheck announced it reliably enough every 2 weeks. He knew the shape of the system. But what Albright gave him was the evidence that the system knew it was the system, that the people running it had understood, at some level of institutional consciousness, that there were moments when it produced results that needed to disappear. The body camera retention logs told that story. Reginald pulled them as part of the expanded public records request Dessa filed after Albright's call. What the logs showed was this. In the last 18 months, 7 formal deletion requests had been submitted by officers in the department for body camera footage from misdemeanor stops. 7 requests, all 7 from officers whose citation volume had dropped below quota in the same period the footage was recorded. All 7 approved, under the existing retention policy, before the footage reached the mandatory preservation threshold. 7 times. In 18 months, an officer whose numbers were low had recorded a stop that produced footage inconsistent with a clean enforcement narrative, and the footage had been requested for deletion, and the deletion had been granted, and the record had been quietly closed. Not hidden dramatically, just closed. The way you close a door you'd prefer stayed shut, in a building where no one has yet thought to check whether the doors are being locked from the inside. Dessa's bill would have made every one of those deletions impossible. The provision she had written required independent review of any deletion request tied to an active misdemeanor filing. It would have caught all 7. It had not yet passed, which meant all 7 were gone, except as logged requests in a retention system that recorded the fact of the deletion even when it couldn't recover the footage itself. The requests were evidence of the deletions. The deletions were evidence of the system. The system was evidence of 11 years of institutional decision-making that had produced a department financially dependent on over-policing one community and operationally committed to suppressing the record of that dependency whenever it became inconvenient. Reginald put it in a report. 41 pages. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, without editorializing, without reaching beyond what the numbers supported, without a single sentence that an opposing attorney could characterize as advocacy rather than analysis. The data said what it said, and his job was to make sure it said it clearly enough that no one in the room could claim they hadn't understood it. The financial architecture $4.2 million in annual overtime, generated by a quota system that had never been written into policy because writing it into policy would have required City Council approval and City Council scrutiny. 11 years of off-the-books incentive structure, paid for with public money. The racial architecture: 73% of citations issued to black pedestrians in a neighborhood that was 41% black. 3 years of data, thousands of individual stops, a number too consistent across too long a period to be attributed to anything other than direction. The procedural architecture: 7 footage deletions in 18 months, all tied to below-quota officers, all approved under a retention policy that had been designed, whether intentionally or through neglect, without the independent review mechanism that would have made the deletions impossible. 3 columns, 3 numbers, 1 portrait. Dessa sent the report to Senator Paulette Greer on a Thursday evening. She did not include a cover letter. The 41 pages were the cover letter. By Friday morning, 2 of the 6 undecided senators had called Greer's office requesting a meeting. Not a briefing. A meeting. The distinction mattered. A briefing is something you attend to be informed. A meeting is something you request when you have already decided something and need to understand what comes next. 2 of the 6 had decided something. The other 4 were about to see the body camera footage. There is something Dessa has not said aloud to anyone. Not to Reginald, not to Senator Greer, not to her father Tobias, who spent 40 years as a civil rights attorney and would understand it better than most. She has not said it because saying it requires a kind of honesty that is harder than building a bill, harder than cataloging procedural violations in the back of a patrol car, harder than any of the work she has done in the last 14 months. The work was also distance. Every month she spent refining the bill's language the quota system was running. Every week she spent building the evidentiary framework. Turley was on Auburn Avenue hitting his number. Every day she spent inside the professional insulation of her office, her clearance, on her title, the particular armor that 20 years of credentials inside the legal system had built around her. The people the bill was designed to protect were standing on that same street, without any of it. She knows this. She has known it in the peripheral way you know things you are not yet ready to look at directly. The arrest made her look directly, because here is the truth she has been circling. She did not cross Auburn Avenue in fear that morning. She crossed it in confidence. The confidence of a woman who has spent 2 decades learning exactly how the law works and building her standing inside it, who carries, even in the act of jaywalking, the unconscious assurance that the system is something she knows how to navigate. That confidence is real. It is also a form of armor. And armor, by definition, is something not everyone is given. The people the quota system targets on Auburn Avenue do not have her clearance. They do not have her title or her 20 years of procedural literacy or the knowledge that his body camera retention policy requires 90 days minimum preservation. They have what they've always had, which is the street and the stop, and whatever they can hold on to inside themselves while it is happening. Most of them do not have a bill in committee. Most of them do not have a closing argument forming in the back of the patrol car. Most of them have a citation they cannot afford, and a record they cannot expunge, and a system that has been running for 11 years, precisely because the cost of running it falls almost entirely on people who have the least institutional recourse to make it stop. And she thinks about her grandmother Naomi. Naomi Drummond marched in Atlanta in 1963 without a law degree and without a bill and without a credential of any kind that the system she was marching against was required to recognize. She sat at lunch counters the law said she had no right to sit at. She was arrested twice, not for anything she had done, but for being in a chair. She came home both times, made dinner, and went back the next day. Not because she had armor, because she had something that didn't require the system's permission to be real. A certainty that the law was wrong and a willingness to put her body against it until it changed. Dessa has been building from the inside. She has been using the law as the weapon her grandmother taught her it could be. And she does not know, sitting with this, honestly for the first time, whether that is the same thing Naomi did. Whether building the architecture of reform from inside the institution is the same act of courage as walking into a building that wants you gone and sitting down anyway. She thinks it might not be the same thing. She thinks it might still be necessary. She thinks those two thoughts can both be true simultaneously, and that holding them together without resolving them into something more comfortable is part of what the work actually requires. What she knows for certain is that it must be faster. The morning after Albright calls, before she pulls the full folder, before she calls Reginald, she opens her legal pad to a fresh page, and in the margin at the top, she writes 2 words: emergency provision. An investigation trigger that doesn't require a completed case file or a legislative session or 14 months of careful construction. A complaint mechanism that can move within 60 days. Something that closes the distance between the building of the law and the people the law is being built for. She writes it in the margin first. She will write it into the bill later. Her grandmother had gone back the next day. Dessa was going to make sure the next day came faster. The Georgia State Senate chamber filled the way it fills when the people inside it understand that what is about to happen will be remembered. Not with ceremony, with attention. The particular stillness of a room where everyone has already decided to pay close attention and is waiting for the thing they came to witness. Senator Paulette Greer had spent 6 weeks preparing for this day, with the methodical patience of a woman who had been waiting far longer than 6 weeks. She had the 41-page report. She had Sergeant Albright's formal deposition, 14 years of service, 3 dismissed complaints, a personnel file that called his integrity insubordination, delivered to the committee in a testimony where he answered every question directly and did not once look away from the camera. She had Reginald Osei's data portrait, the entered into the record in full. She had the body camera footage, cleared for public release under the department's own existing retention policy, the one Dessa's bill would eventually replace, the one that had allowed 7 deletions in 18 months, but had not allowed this one, because Turley had never filed a deletion request for a stop that had gone exactly the way he expected it to go. And she had Dessa. Dessa testified for 31 minutes. She did not describe her arrest as a personal injury. She did not use the word injustice. She did not give the chamber a story about herself because the chamber did not need her story. The chamber needed what she had spent 14 months building, and what the morning on Auburn Avenue had made impossible to look away from. She placed citation number 004-1-887 in a table. Her booking report, her body camera timestamp. Beside them, in the same table, 311 other incidents. Same zip code, same 36-month window, same pattern of misdemeanor stops, same procedural irregularities, same overtime correlation. 312 incidents total. 73% of them issued to black pedestrians in a neighborhood that was 41% black. She did not say this happened to me. She said this happened 312 times. She said she had documentation for every one of them. She said hers was the one with body camera footage, because hers was the one where the officer did not file a deletion request, because he had no reason to believe this particular stop would become anything other than what every other stop had become: background noise, processed and absorbed and forgotten. He had been wrong about that. Then the footage played. Turley's camera, Auburn Avenue, 9:14 a.m., a Tuesday in October. Dessa on the sidewalk, hands already visible before he asked, ID already out before he reached for it, her whole bearing communicating the specific fluency of a woman who knows the procedure because she has been studying it for 14 months. His screen, the clean return. No priors, no warrants, nothing. His hands moving toward the cuffs anyway. The chamber was very quiet, not the 4-second silence of shock. Something longer, something that had weight and texture, and the particular quality of air in a room where people are seeing confirmed what they have long understood to be true, but have not yet been required to act on. The 6 undecided senators were not in the same place they had been 6 weeks ago, before the 41 pages, and the deposition, and the data portrait, and the woman at the testimony table who had described her own arrest without once making it about herself. Senator Greer called the vote, 38 to 18. The 6 who had been undecided, all 6 voted yes. Not because the footage was dramatic, because the footage was ordinary, because what it showed was not an aberration. It was the system working exactly as it had been designed to work, on a morning when it happened to record itself clearly enough that no one in that chamber could claim they hadn't understood what they were looking at. In his office on the 4th floor of the department building, Chief Raymond Dosser watched the vote count appear on the television screen above his desk. He did not wait for the gavel. He opened his desk drawer, took out a legal pad, and began writing his retirement letter before the final tally was confirmed. 11 years, $4.2 million in annual overtime, 3 of Albright's complaints dismissed, 7 footage deletions approved, 1 stop on Auburn Avenue that he had believed, right up until this moment, he had managed. He had not managed anything. The gavel came down. The Georgia Pattern and Practice Accountability Act was signed into law 11 weeks after the floor vote. The governor held a ceremony. There were photographs. Dessa was not in them. She had returned to her office before the signing pen was capped because there was work on her desk, and the work did not pause for ceremonies, and she had never believed that the signing was the accomplishment. The signing was the beginning of the accomplishment. What came after was the point. What came after moved faster than any investigation her office had ever opened. Under the emergency provision, the 2 words she had written in the margin of her notes the morning after Albright called, drafted into the bill's final language. I passed into law with the rest of it. The AG's office opened a formal investigation into Turley's department within 60 days of the act taking effect, not the 14 months of careful construction that the bill itself had required. 60 days. The provision worked exactly the way she had designed it to work, which is to say, it worked the way her grandmother's certainty had always insisted things needed to work, without the luxury of patience that costs other people more than it costs you. The investigation produced a consent decree, mandatory expansion of body camera retention to 180 days, with independent review required for every deletion request, regardless of the filing status of the underlying stop. An independent oversight board with real authority, not advisory, not recommendatory, but binding review power over significant enforcement decisions. And for the first time in the department's history, a quota system prohibition written explicitly into official policy. Not implied, not assumed, written. The thing Dosser had never needed to put on paper, because the paycheck said it for him, now existed in the permanent record as a named and prohibited practice. 11 officers faced disciplinary review. Their citation patterns fell outside the statistical range, consistent with genuine enforcement. Reginald's methodology, applied now with the investigative authority of the state behind it, was precise enough to identify the specific officers whose numbers told the clearest story. Turley was not among the 11. He was a cog. He had been operating inside a machine he had not built and did not fully understand, following an incentive structure that had been designed long before he arrived. The machine was what got restructured. Turley continued to serve, under a new policy framework, a new chain of command, and an oversight board that now had the authority to review every significant enforcement decision he made for the remainder of his career. The woman he had handcuffed on a Tuesday morning had built the board that would watch him for the next 20 years. Chief Raymond Dosser retired with his pension intact. His retirement party was attended by 40 people. It was not covered by the press. He had spent 11 years building a system he believed was too embedded to be dismantled and too invisible to be seen. He had been wrong on both counts, and he left the building knowing it, which was perhaps the only accountability the law could reach him with. It reached him with it fully. Sergeant Corin Albright was promoted to lieutenant. His 3 internal complaints, dismissed, buried, answered with a note calling his integrity insubordination, were formally expunged from his personnel file and replaced with a commendation for documented integrities in the face of institutional pressure. He did not ask for a ceremony. He asked for the commendation to be placed in the permanent record. It was. He went back to work. Reginald Osei's 41-page report became a training document. The methodology, cross-referencing citation data with overtime records to surface informal quota systems that were never written down and therefore never supposed to be findable, was adopted as standard practice for pattern and practice investigations in 3 other states within 18 months. The invisible made visible, filed, cited, replicated, and Dessa was already at her desk. There is a second bill, pretextual traffic stops. The data is already in. 14 months of work ahead, maybe more, the kind of careful construction that the law requires and that she is no longer willing to do slowly. The emergency provision is already drafted. She is not starting from the same place she started 14 months ago. She's starting from everything she learned about what patience costs when it is not yours to spend. So she starts on a Tuesday. On the wall of her office, in a plain frame, is citation number 0041-887. 2 charges. Both dismissed. Signed by Officer Glen Turley on a Tuesday morning in October, on a street he believed he owned, with a body camera running that he had no reason to worry about. Beneath it, on an index card in her grandmother Naomi's handwriting, pressed into Dessa's hand at law school graduation, held for 20 years, read and reread, until the ink wore soft at the creases, the words Naomi said not to open until Dessa understood what she was going to do with the law she had just been given. The law is a weapon, baby. Make sure you know who's holding it. Dessa knows. She has known since before the cuffs went on. She was just waiting for the right Tuesday to prove it. Dessa didn't win because she was lucky. But she won because she built the law before they knew she was building it, documented everything they tried to make disappear, and refused to let 14 months of work die in the back of a patrol car on a Tuesday morning. If this story hit you the way it hit us, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story is already waiting, and it hits just as hard.